So welcome back. I'm Toni Griffin. I'm professor of practice here at the Graduate School of Design in the Department of Planning and Urban Development. And I'd like to thank Diane Davis for ushering me into this conference. I'm new here, just starting this semester, and I'm very delighted to be part of this conversation. I have a bit of bad news. Zaha Hadid died this morning at the age of 65, suddenly, of a heart attack. And so that's a bit of sad news for us female architects, because there are so few of us, and female architects of color in particular. So I'm sorry to share that bad news. The other bit of bad news is that I'm the only thing standing between you and a cocktail. Or a flight. But with that in mind, I've taken on the goal to be sure to leave you today inspired by reflections, aspirations, and actions, as our panel, the final panel, is called Reconstructing for a Better Future. So let me start with just a bit of my reflections of sitting here over the last day and an evening, and perhaps some of my projections as I then introduce our four closing panelists who will inspire us to action. So my work is very much steeped in working in contested cities like St. Louis. My last big project was actually Detroit Future City. So I'm very familiar, and I grew up on the south side of Chicago, so I'm very deeply, personally and professionally, very familiar with the contexts that have been spoken about today. And they're just, a couple of themes that have really siphoned through all the panels and all the speakers today. A big one was fragmentation. This political fragmentation that has been embedded and rooted in the culture of this place, both racially, through municipal lenses, through regulation, and through identity. Fragmentation that has been culturally embedded, again through identity and race, but also through territory and engagement. And to the extent that that is perpetuated, embedded, and needs to be broken in some way seems key. The issue of agency, who has it and who doesn't. And I think one of the underlying conversations that Eve's panel wanted to surface is really the agency of us in the design and planning space. And I think we saw lots of examples where our agency helped to further embed fragmentation and injustice. And I think we want to hear, and I'm looking forward to hearing the comments from Michael and Patty, for example, and the way in which our agency might begin to shift the way in which this fragmentation is so deeply embedded, but also the agency of community actors and their capacity and their position to be able to be more effective agents of their own change, as I think one of our last speakers, Sylvester, spoke to, and also raising the issue of how institutions begin to pivot in their roles of agency. And all of these need to really be working collaboratively. I think a lot of the examples we saw looked at how these different agents work in silos. And I think the 21st century requires cross-sectoral agency work. We also saw the issues called segregation throughout most of the panels, but I like to frame them as black space and white space, which has come up quite a bit here too. And in the black space, we tended to talk about and see the effects of that black space as being isolated space. We also saw some examples where the intervention, and we had questions populating the conference about scale and scale of interventions. And we often see the scale of intervention in those spaces of isolations be small. They're about creative placemaking or tactical urbanism or urban agriculture. And clearly, the weight you must feel by hearing the barriers that we're up against in these cities must surely suggest that we need bolder, broader, more expansive intervention in the spaces of blackness. In the spaces of whiteness, it's the opposite. And I venture to say that 90% of people in this room grew up in a segregated community. I just need you to sit with that just for a second, because probably the majority of people in this room don't think about themselves as growing up in a segregated community, whereas I, who grew up on the black side of the south side of Chicago, am constantly reminded of that, in part by the way we frame that conversation in rooms like this. But we all are likely living in or have grown up in segregated space. And the white space creates a kind of exclusion in that Black bodies often don't feel included in the white space. Black bodies are not seen to fit often in the white space. If we take, for example, the case of Trayvon Martin, for example, and the perception of his Black body in the white space. But the interventions in the scale of the white space seem to be scalarly larger. They're about investment in transit and retail amenity and mixed use and mixed income development, right? And often sometimes those investments happen on the cusp of the Black-white space where the Black space becomes the white space. The other issue, and the last issue that came up that I observed in our conversations that I want us to reflect upon is this notion of injustice. And it's interesting that the last panel was the panel where we named it, injustice, inequality. And that when we start from the morning to where we ended in this last really exuberant conversation, the struggle for the rights and recognition of Black folks has been underway for the last 150 years. And the specific struggle for right is different, but it is still a struggle in many cases for basic rights, welfare, and more importantly, recognition. And there was a really wonderful quote that was in one of Professor Brown's amazing videos that talked about the notion of injustice is not always associated with an action, but usually associated with an inaction. And I think that gets at some of the last rounds of questions that were thrown at this panel. And I hope that some of what we can do on our panel is begin to suggest some ways to encourage you all to think about actions you can and must take as citizens of the city, because injustice and inequality affects us all as we all live in such segregated spaces. So my aspiration for you, if we can hit my one slide, is about how do we make these issues everyone's issues. And so in my work, which I started about 5 years ago, in both the academic space and the practice space, is the notion of the Just City. And I've brought my work here, and I'm launching the Just City Lab here at the GSD. And it's trying to find a way to have conversations and pivot on the planning practice to be more value-based. And to me, part of that is trying to embed a language that is value-based, that allows us to have these tough, uncomfortable, conflicting, painful conversations if we are in fact to move forward. And so one of the things that we do is begin to think about the vocabulary of values that we're all collectively after, as opposed to starting the conversation with the tactic. Because I believe that we're going to be able to find common ground if we actually recognize we're all after very common values. And I just want to read sort of the 5 affinity group values to you, because those of you who are 30 and under can probably read them all, and those not, probably not. But the issue, and I want to read these because I think in listening to the remarks today, these are the kinds of things, these are the kind of injustices for which I want my Just City to include: acceptance, aspiration, and fairness, power, engagement, and yes, we must have contest and debate in the Just City, aesthetics, identity, mobility, and choice, and just welfare and rights, these basic needs that some of us take for granted and some of us are still deeply struggling for. So let me introduce the 4 panelists who are going to even further inspire us to how we might achieve the Just City for St. Louis and others. We're going to start with Michael Willis, who founded MWA Architects in 1988, where he's a principal, and he just recently taught a seminar at WashU. He's an architect that has worked on several mixed-use affordable housing projects and neighborhood revitalization projects, and he's going to start our panel because he is from St. Louis, and as he said, you know, he cannot escape some of the images of Pruitt-Igoe as he has grown up in his life. But I think he's going to start us off as one of us, as an architect, in some visions for the city, but really rooted in his perspective of a very uniquely lived past in that city. We're then going to move to Margaret Garb, who's a professor of American history at Washington University, where she's also a co-director of the Prison Education Project. And she has numerous articles on housing, segregation, urban poverty, and urban planning. And she's going to talk to us and provide us with lessons from the CDC space, and specifically talk to us about the Beyond Housing Project, and the ways with which that work that they've done provides some lessons for us, and particularly after the police shooting of Michael Brown. We'll then move to Patty Hayda, who is an alumni of the GSD and an assistant professor of architecture and urban design at the Sam Fox School at WashU, and who studies uncharted processes of contemporary redevelopment in her writing. And she's going to introduce this notion of the unbuilding and the building, and some of the challenges and metrics by which we look at and try to address the issues of vacancy and abandonment and dealing with these issues of injustice. And then finally, we're going to end with Antonio French, who's in his second term as the city's Board of Aldermen in the 21st Ward. And I know your face because during Ferguson, I often saw you flash across my screen as I was watching this, standing in the middle of what I can only imagine was just a natural instinct to ensure activism and voice and engagement and peace in that city. And he's going to end our panel with his firsthand, everyday fight aspirations for where he'd like his city to go. So with that, let me invite Michael Willis to the podium. Thank you.
I ask that be the first, oh, good afternoon. Now, I'm standing between you and a cocktail. But I wanted that to be the first slide because just to Tony's description, my segregated space was, in 1956, was 2140 Cass in Pruitt, not Igo. And in 1972, got a chance as an architecture student in St. Louis to go and see it get blown up. A very interesting closing of the circle. But I wanted to talk with you about the way forward, some opportunities to build for the next future. We've heard a lot about the difficulties of making space, making not just making space, but giving yourself legitimacy in making space for your communities. And I want to talk about something that is an example that I would like to use as a precedent, just to give you some notions about constructing a better future. Which button? The big green one? Hot dog. Okay, and so this is you'll have to read my blog along with me, but this is about a development project that took a public housing project and restored it to the neighborhood, removed the sort of the island nature of the public housing, reconnected the city streets, and recreated the community. And technically, you can't say recreated the community was already there. Lafitte was isolated from it. We just returned Lafitte back to Treme, back to the neighborhood it belonged to. So the idea here for us is that it wasn't just about designing 417 houses. It was thinking about a neighborhood design in a comprehensive way and trying to understand the bigger framework where where that stripe of housing was going to go, but understand the bigger neighborhood, understand where the transportation was, and link it to jobs, services, schools, and all those things that matter to a neighborhood. Yes, we were going to design the houses, but first we had to understand place. one of the questions we were asked to consider is what social, spatial, political, and economic projects should be researched? Well, talking to a number of my colleagues, we understand that the spatial has to do with the city fabric. The former Irish neighborhood, which is now La Mission in San Francisco, they didn't bring the buildings with them. The fabric was there. And as the populations moved, they moved, slapped some really great murals on the wall. It is now an absolutely Hispanic neighborhood, but they didn't bring the fabric with them. The fabric was there. So the conclusion is preserve the urban fabric and let new development happen within it. Politically, it would be good to see the aldermanic leaders of the 28 wards and the mayor and the business interests working in concert on targeted improvement projects rather than act in competition for scarce resources. It was pointed out here that in the race for resources, Washington University, not counting St. Louis or University of Missouri, it was Washington University with its $6 billion endowment has more ability to move forward on projects than perhaps does the city. But to Adrian's point, it's possible on the political side that once those forces see their mutual benefit, that St. Louis, with its newly emerging innovation economy, based in research universities, would be that business partner. I've just come from a conference in Heidelberg where that was the entire point of the discussion. How can research universities and cities work together for mutual benefit? Sometimes the university takes the lead in development because they have the resources to, but how can this also work for the city? These are not on-campus projects. These are projects in cities. Economically, there are some good examples right now in St. Louis that I admire. There is the development work in what is now called Botanical Heights, just 2 blocks from Henry Shaw's Tower Grove Park and the Missouri Botanical Garden. That's building the neighborhood to the senator's point, filling in those empty gaps with new housing and making it possible in renovated buildings for new services, new shops, restaurants, and a charter school, the City Garden School, that I visited last February, and to show to me the indicator that it was probably one of the most remarkable schools I attended in St. Louis while I was visiting. I was there on Martin Luther King Day, and I was greeted to the spectacle of a very small Chinese girl singing "Lift Every Voice and Sing." And the makeup of City Garden said, yeah, that's what the city is going to look like. It's not either you here or you there. That's what the city is going to look like. And so the schools, I think, are an important part of what's going to make our cities grow, getting that part right in early education. We could see that model extend to other parts in St. Louis, but why should it? There should be an outside driver of change that can't be ignored. In New Orleans, it was Katrina. Had to rethink everything. Infrastructure, housing, jobs could not be ignored. And so the effort was, what's the best way we can do that? In St. Louis, it may well be the research economy competing for the best students in the world. We're not bending steel anymore in the city limits, and thank God the rendering plants and the meatpacking plants are long gone. You knew where they were on a hot summer's day. But so now, how do we support this new economy, and that needs not only work for spaces for work and labs, but also places for the postdocs to live. They don't make that much money, but they have families, and they need and not only that, but the people that support this whole enterprise. I think that is a a driver that I've seen in other examples, other cities, that could work here as well. A cost-benefit analysis should show why it makes sense for the companies who come and co-locate next to these innovation hubs in the biomedical space, why it makes sense for them also to invest in housing. The identity or the brand of the city is coincident with the brand of the research university. We spoke of that earlier today. They have to work together. And just to give you an example, at Lafitte, we were tasked with rebuilding this neighborhood post-Katrina with new housing and infrastructure. And here's, at the bottom there, is a 3-minute review of Lafitte's process, aided and abetted by this woman here, Miss Imelda Paul, who is really the mother of Lafitte for over 35 years. She lived there before. She was there doing all the debates of should we tear it down, should we not, and then she stood up, not we stood up, and said, we should have a new Lafitte. It would not have happened without her. But here's the 3-minute version of our process. Listen first and then design. Walk the neighborhood and find and ask what's needed. Not tell, but ask what's needed. Then workshop your way to the answer with a diverse working group, including the people who are going to be responsible for the economics. That did include enterprise. I saw Michelle Wetton up there from trained in East St. Louis. Enterprise is one of the funders and the developers of this project. Rebuild the city grid. Lafitte, like most of these public housing projects, cut themselves off. The planners cut Lafitte off from the city grid except for a couple of places, and our goal was to reconnect Lafitte with the rest of the city. So rebuild the city, connect to transportation, and make walking irresistible. Make a project in a scale that matters. Here we took 400 houses. We took this space here, and 400 houses was enough to really affect everything else around it. And it made us look at this larger neighborhood and see over here in that space right now we have $2 billion of new medical center that you can walk out of your door, turn right, and walk down to one of the largest job centers in the South. You're 6 blocks from the French Quarter, and we're talking about taking this freeway, this neighborhood divider down and making it a surface street. So there's the new hospitals up at the top, and there is on the 10th anniversary of Katrina, the president stopping by with the mayor to kiss babies and to see how the neighborhood really has become a better place. So this is it takes a big canvas, and all of the people that should be involved are, yes, the usual suspects, the city, but not just the city writ large, but the city writ specific, streets and sewers. Instead of the building inspection, instead of having these individual site improvement silos, one voice from the city, a driver from the financial side and the university side, and the city side to build projects of some scale, maybe 1,000 units, why not, for the new millennial, something that you can actually achieve. So that's the summary. And these are not fantasies of urban design. When we ask what do these underserved communities want, they want what people in the Garden District want or the people in the Central West End want. They want to walk to transportation shops, maybe not walk to $4 lattes, but that's available if you want it. But to be able to be in a community where all those things are connected with transportation. So here are the 4 lessons from Lafitte. Collaboration, create a broadly configured working group with a commitment to the neighborhood, not just the block. Permission, to look beyond your own job description and become an advocate for the greater neighborhood. Responsibility, to build the neighborhood, but build it better. And memory, this is important, to use the memory of place to make the rebuilding authentic to its residents. St. Louis, even in its broken state, has a great story to tell, and we want to be able to tell that story. It's not no place, it's actually some specific place, and we should tell that story because St. Louis is the story, and you can be the storyteller. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I want to thank you. It's good to be here. I want to thank everyone for staying around all afternoon. It's been a long day, but a really interesting day, and I just want to say it's been really fascinating to me to see all these different approaches to St. Louis, different ways of thinking about the city, of analyzing the city, of addressing its problems or thinking about its problems. I'm a bit of an outlier here on this panel. I'm a historian, so I'm not usually on panels that talk about even the present, much less the future. So bear with me on that. I'm also not usually, I'm not always that good with PowerPoints and slides, because in history classes we don't always use them. And also, I would just say, I think that I'm happy to be giving this talk right now, just after Michael's talk. It's a good pairing with what Michael just described. And it also adds to what Ken Reardon discussed this morning about East St. Louis. So it's a bit of connecting some of those pieces, or actually adding another layer to them. And in some ways, in response to Tony's introduction, it is another kind of small-scale intervention with bigger ambitions. So Tony asked me initially to talk about policies that did not work in St. Louis, or about past mistakes and how we might move beyond them. And so, obviously, as you all know, after sitting through all this discussion today, there's a lot to choose from if you wanted to talk about bad policies. But I decided instead, being a little bit obstinate, to talk about something that appears to be working, though slowly, a kind of plodding turtle of a program, gradually building human capital, gradually strengthening social networks, gradually altering the built environment of North St. Louis County. But again, I can't help it. I have to talk a little bit briefly about the history of community development corporations. Can't let that history go. But I'm going to talk in particular about a community development corporation that has been working in the Normandy School District for the past 15 years. And there it is. That's the area that they've been working in. Ferguson is just to the north of that, of there. And the group is called Beyond Housing. It's a CDC that was launched by Neighborhood Housing Services in St. Louis in the 1980s. But before I get to that, I have to talk a little bit of the history of CDCs. So community development corporations, many of you may already know all of this, so give a brief overview, are locally controlled nonprofit organizations. Usually they use funds from foundations, corporations, individuals, government entities. These days most are working with government tax credits, and they work to rebuild urban and rural communities. The earliest CDCs were formed in the US, not some are earlier, but the big kind of movement to form CDCs comes in the late 1960s with federal anti-poverty grants. And the theory behind the CDCs came out of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, and most especially the community action programs run out of the Office of Economic Opportunity. The programs were designed to encourage what they called maximum feasible participation, to allow communities to develop programs to address issues related to poverty. And it largely was a reaction to urban renewal, to the top-down policies of federal programs, a reaction to the role of urban planners who claimed expertise in neighborhoods, parachuted in, drew plans, and in many places, including St. Louis, replaced working-class African-American communities, the Mill Creek Valley, of course, with high-rise, poorly maintained public housing like Pruitt-Igoe. We know that story. So community action programs signaled a kind of delegitimization of planners, an assertion that rather than relying on highly educated elite planners, community residents themselves could claim expertise in their own lives and develop programs for their own communities. Community action agencies had boards made up of neighborhood residents. They set their own budgets, and the idea was to give residents of poor and working class neighborhoods the power and resources to transform their communities. These were, I guess not surprisingly, the most controversial aspect of the Great Society programs, which themselves were controversial. They started in 1964 with $300 million, and they never got much more funding beyond that. Some of these groups came together. They organized rent strikes in public housing. They did political organizing to oust corrupt and incompetent municipal officials. Some put pressure on housing court officials to punish absentee landlords. They engaged in a host of activities which, in many cases, angered big city mayors, angered developers, angered policymakers in cities. So the Community Action Program was modified in 1967 in response to these problems, and it basically gave mayors control of boards of local community action boards. Some programs in the end were quite successful, though we really don't know how successful they might have been, because as I say, funding was limited. City officials ultimately kind of corrupted the idea because money had to go through City Hall rather than directly to community action organizations. And just a few years later, the federal government began its long retreat from funding for cities in general, in particular low-income housing programs, and President Nixon closed for good the Office of Economic Opportunity in 1974. But as the federal government retreated from funding urban housing programs in the 1970s and 80s, many CDCs were successful in taking up the slack. Probably, at least to my mind, the most successful model of this kind of public, and so the language of public-private partnership, which really comes out of the 1920s and Herbert Hoover, but becomes really widespread in the 1970s and 80s. And I would argue it's a sort of cover for the public retreat from funding and intervention in cities. But anyway, the sort of most successful of this kind of public-private partnerships, I would argue, is the nonprofit Community Corporation in Newark, New Jersey. It was organized in 1968 after riots left large portions of Newark burned out and filled with rubble. It began by building low-cost housing, basically began on 2 acres of land. It began with federal and state grants to purchase the land and for grants for upfront construction costs. And then as government money disappeared, New Community was able to use its properties as collateral for loans, to use its success to get grants from private foundations like the Ford Foundation, and by the late 1980s had created more than 2,500 housing units for low-income people, housing for the elderly poor, housing for people with AIDS, and in addition, it built and operated a child care center. Today, New Community has job training programs, a food bank, owns several $1 million in real estate, and has part interest in a Pathway supermarket in the neighborhood. So CDCs effectively used government money to lower initial land purchases and construction costs. But as government grants dried up, those who sought to organize new CDCs were more heavily dependent on government funding, or were more heavily dependent on government funding, often failed or ended up unable to maintain the housing they had built. So some of this comes from poor management, which sometimes comes from a philosophy of local control and discrediting professionals, local residents or boards of directors with little or no experience or training in construction, financing, maintenance of housing, take on these responsibilities, and sometimes it just doesn't work. But failed CDCs typically were launched without government funding. And so I think a key point is that it illustrates the difficulty of building housing for low-income people without government support. One way to generate capital for investment in CDCs came from the establishment of a couple national nonprofits. And I think the 2 most prominent are the Local Initiative Support Corporation and Neighborhood Housing Services. These are national groups that provide financial aid and technical advice for CDCs, and I think they're really quite innovative in terms of their funding mechanisms. LISC was launched in Washington, D.C. in 1982 with a grant from the Ford Foundation. It provides grants, loans, equity investments for CDCs for neighborhood redevelopment. It helps in the development of affordable housing, commercial facilities, job-creating industrial projects. It brings private sector resources and development expertise, how to raise money for projects, how to target money in a struggling neighborhood, how to maintain properties, all of that together. It works on a very corporate model. It gathers investment funds from corporations, which it uses as a pool of capital for CDCs around the country. And it also has a secondary mortgage fund for mortgages on low-income housing. So it's a very sophisticated and complex financing mechanism. And they've invested, since they were founded, they've invested more than $16 billion, with a B, $billion, in low-income urban communities in the past 35 years. The other kind of big national organization is Neighborhood Housing Services, and it's much less corporate. It's a coalition of CDCs, similar to LISC, but using much less corporate funding. So Beyond Housing in St. Louis is a CDC that began as part of a neighborhood housing network. Its executive director, Chris Kremeyer, graduated from Washington University with a degree in urban studies, and in 2000, Beyond Housing launched a program in Pagedale, which you can see up there, a tiny municipality in North St. Louis County, a couple miles south of Ferguson. Pagedale had a population of about 3,600 people. Pagedale had been incorporated in 1950. At that point, its population was 10,000, largely white and working class. Many were employed with the Lever Brothers, a manufacturer of powdered detergent. But in the 1960s, just as black families from North St. Louis were, after years of redlining, able to find housing and loans and pressure local realtors to sell houses to them in Pagedale, white residents and unionized jobs began leaving. In the 1990s, Lever Brothers employed just 500 people, and then it cut its workforce to 170. And finally, in 2002, the firm's parent company, which was based in Rotterdam, shut down the Pagedale plant entirely. And that same year, Pagedale's second largest employer, a lumber and hardware firm, closed, as did the town's last McDonald's, which people in Pagedale see as a sign of really the complete collapse of the community. The 2000 census found just 3,600 people, 92% were African American. The median household income was a little over $23,000 as compared to over $50,000 in St. Louis County. And so this project to revive the community was launched when the then mayor of Pagedale invited Beyond Housing to build and renovate affordable housing in Pagedale. And so Chris Kremeyer saw this as an opportunity to initiate a much broader approach on economic redevelopment, a holistic and place-based strategy that rather than displacing impoverished residents would be guided by Pagedale residents. So their first step, Kremeyer says, was to build leadership in the community. He worked with the St. Louis County Planning Department and the mayor's office, and they sponsored a series of focus groups in the winter of 2000. Out of those gatherings, they formed a community association, the first community association in Pagedale aside from church groups. And then the community association, obviously filled with members of the community, held a series of public meetings and set out community-wide surveys to write a vision statement and set a series of short-term and long-term goals, which became the Community Action Plan. And the pillars of the plan were community involvement, investment in housing, and the provision of social services. So Beyond Housing, I'll just show you a little bit of what they've done. They've built some low-income housing. They've provided loans for low-income people to purchase homes. They've done a plan for Page Avenue where they're trying to create a new kind of town center in Pagedale. So here's the plan that they've been working on. Here's Page Avenue. Before they've done much of this work. At the corner, you can see that corner where they actually do build some senior housing. They put in a grocery store, the first grocery store in the community in 30 years. They actually build the senior housing, the bank. Most recently, here's what that corner looked like before. Here's the Stop and Shop that they built. The senior housing that they put up in the last 10 years. And then most recently, they put in a movie theater because people in the community said they wanted a movie theater. They were sick of having no entertainment in the neighborhood. And they put in bike lanes, they put in new sidewalks, And so this is the beginning of this effort. I was just going to conclude by saying, last weekend on Sunday morning, I was out in Pagedale taking pictures, walking around talking to people. And one of the things that I noticed as I was doing this were all of these signs. I don't know if you can see that sign. Here's another one. On almost all of these lawns, people have these signs everywhere. And so what you really see is this is a very organized community. It's a politically engaged community. And Denise Ward-Brown was sort of pointing this out to me, that when people are asking about what happened with the uprising in Ferguson, one of the things that people forget is that these are communities that had been organizing for a long time. And Pagedale is one of the examples of this. This is a community that has been organizing residents for at least the past 15 years. And so it's not surprising that people would come together to protest the police shooting of Michael Brown. Thanks, I'm out of time.
Okay. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to talk about McCreetown, which Michael mentioned just now. It's now known as Botanical Heights. And I want to tell a sort of complicated story of McCreetown. This is considered a rebounding neighborhood. So just to give you some context, it's located right here. And just south of the central corridor, which is the kind of dominant axis, east-west axis here, it's been labeled a rebounding neighborhood, and for many reasons. And part of my job today is to show you what has worked there, what some of the particularities of the redevelopment there are. But there's a cautionary tale here, and I also want to make sure that we have some takeaways in that regard. Rebuilding in most cities, especially in St. Louis, first involves unbuilding. And this is an important concept and something that we've seen in many of the evidence that we've seen today. I have a recent book on American cities, Rebuilding American Cities, and it's a theme that came through in many cities. And McCree in particular has a loaded history of unbuilding, which is these sort of erasure as urbanism. So while we talk about reconstructing a future, while we talk about rebounding and how to get there, we have to remember that these are variable concepts. They're mobilized differently according to your relationship to the process. So to start, McCree has always been a historically divided city. It grew at the turn of the century. It was an immigrant district just north of these two gardens that were mentioned this morning, the Botanical Garden and Tower Grove Park. And bounded by the north, you see at the north by this, what's now a historic Liggett & Myers tobacco factory, and to the south here, the Botanical Garden. Like so many areas of St. Louis, though, we know this story, in the 70s, it became immediately isolated and depopulated by the construction of Interstate 44 on that southern edge. This literally cut it off from its anchor institution, which was the Missouri Botanical Gardens, and of course started the spiral of disinvestment and crime that we've seen in many cases in St. Louis today. From 1970 to 1990, it lost 50% of its white population. It was 99% white before the 70s. And by 1990, its nickname was the Dark City. And this referred to its downtrodden trajectory, of course, but also because the streetlights were literally broken, it was a dark place. There was drug trade, crime. Perhaps this was a product of the unofficial policy of benign neglect, right, that was brought up earlier. It needed public support that it wasn't getting, but things started to change in the late 90s once the Botanical Garden made the improvement of McCree their priority. And they realized that they needed to fix this area that was essentially their front door. Botanical Garden entrance is right here, the highway, and McCree just north of that. So if they wanted to maintain their visitorship, this was important. And I want to pull out just a little aside here as a reference that something that's come up earlier, which is this role of the anchor institution. And there's a lot of ways to think about that, but they have huge capacity. They bring stability, they can't move, and political leverage, of course. And we know they can effectuate change around them, but we have to remember that they answer to their board. And they will always need to also act according to the institution's goals. So we can hope that there are alignments of the institution's goals and the neighborhood's goals, and those are not always in sync. And there really is no established check and balance system for guiding how exactly institutions engage their cities. It's a kind of fuzzy area of decision-making and city-making. But in 1999, the Botanical Garden mobilized with the city and other private foundations, and a redevelopment authority was established, and it's now called the Garden District Commission, and a planning process was launched. This is about 2002. And the plan that resulted called for 6 blocks of the 14, so just to go back, called for the 6 blocks here. It's a whole 14-block area to be just completely cleared. This was considered the only way to reset the area, which had the bad reputation. There was no way developers were going to invest here without a radical change. So this is around 2002, 2004. We see urban renewal that we have sort of talked about a lot and mostly referred to in the 1960s, I think, in St. Louis. But just over 10 years ago, quite alive and well in St. Louis. And in fact, erasure is a mainstream mechanism of redevelopment in many parts of St. Louis today, still. And also, in fact, I see it as a kind of, there's a sort of black flight now that's occurring in our cities where redevelopment is setting the stage, right, for the populations that left to come back in. And so we have a kind of reversal. So McCree is also, even the 6 blocks were cleared, but meanwhile, the neighborhood was part of a National Register historic district. And at the time, a petition was filed to reduce this historic district status. That was denied, but instead the whole status was revoked. And this is, that hatch shows all of the historic districts in the area. So all the blocks were cleared and the land was taken by eminent domain. So on the other hand, I guess on the one hand we see urban renewal. On the other hand, there's a kind of I guess an idea that we should take note in regards to historic preservation. And this is, historic preservation came about in the wake of the earlier urban renewal era to protect cities from these kinds of erasures that urban renewal was bringing. And the Missouri Historic Tax Credit and St. Louis tax credits around the historic tax credits are actually model tools in the nation for saving urban fabric. So, but it's ironic because this reveals that the historic preservation designation is more of a malleable designation that is essentially brushed off, you could say here, for the interests of capital accumulation. And later, the historic status gets re-invoked so the architects can use the tax credits later in the phase 2 of this project. So then it's co-opted again to serve the needs of redevelopment. And something was mentioned this morning, I think Walter said something about a disregard of the law that Abraham Lincoln referred to, and it just made me think of some of this that occurs today. even when historic preservation is enforced, it's still protecting material infrastructure, not people around them. So it's a very important policy, but we might look at it as still incomplete somewhat, right? It doesn't protect the people. So to return to the story of McCree, the land was cleared and then immediately sold to a private developer, the home builders McBride and Son. They're suburban home builders, and they created these strange suburban typologies here with much bigger lots, as you can see, attached garages. These were market rate houses, and the area was renamed Botanical Heights. And you can see the cul-de-sac appears, which meant that the 6 blocks, if you remember, which are the eastern portion of McCree, don't connect, in fact, to the remaining portions of McCree. But they sold almost immediately, and they were considered a huge market success. And they were celebrated as one of the biggest market-driven projects in the city. Jim Roos, meanwhile, is the man on the right, and his company is Neighborhood Enterprises. He's a landlord who owned a ton of the buildings within the area that were taken and torn down. Well, he didn't see the project as a success. Almost all of his tenants were relocated. And he talks about the area, he has a different view of the neighborhood that he saw as improving. He talks about the vacancy rates at the time that were actually going down in his books. And that, in fact, to him, the neighborhood got worse after redevelopment plans were announced. And this image is the kind of image that was mostly propagated in the media after the plans were announced. Of course, it helps legitimate the need for whole-scale clearing, but this also reminded me of that image that we've seen about 5 times, the poster advertising the ballot vote for segregation, where there's a sort of threat, right, of black invasion that would destroy neighborhood, and there's this kind of argument that's being made in these images that go out still. So after that phase, which was complete by the 2006 or so. Phase 2 is what I will show you now, and that started in about 2008. So right at as the recession was hitting, phase 2 was to tackle the rest of the remaining blocks, and this part is ongoing now today. So this is a really contemporary project. A young couple moved into the neighborhood who were starting a hybrid architecture contracting and development firm. They're called UIC, is the firm. And they bought a house in the neighborhood that they fixed up, and they started their practice and decided to raise their kids. And they were the young firm that won the bid for phase 2, which they called Botanical Grove. So that's a subset of Botanical Heights. And their strategy here was not to clear those remaining blocks, but to take a totally different approach, to save whatever historic buildings they could. And here's some images, and renovate those, and then infill the lots with new houses. And their houses are environmentally forward. They're green houses with geothermal, ground source heat, and solar panels and other fixtures. And they're unabashedly contemporary, too. And they're actually more contemporary, more contextual, you might say, than the other, the phase 1 homes. Even though they look so different, they keep the grain and the typology and the scale of the existing context. And here are some other images of an existing house restored and one of the new homes. The name changes here, if we follow the name change, which is a very important part of the redevelopment and the rebranding of this neighborhood, they index the transformations from this sort of stigma of the working class and then this minority enclave that's McCree with the poverty of town, to this more upwardly mobile Botanical Heights and the green-minded Botanical Grove even, both of which are linking the neighborhood very sort of securely back to its stable institutional anchor. So the takeaways from this story, this is ongoing. There's some important concepts to point out, but also to be realistic about. Most of us, I think, would look at this phase 2 strategy of incremental infill as a much better way, much more sensitive way to engage the city. It saves the fabric, for sure. If you're interested in bringing a new middle-class market back to the city, this is a much better strategy. The project shows that new construction, so from a design standpoint, the project is demonstrating that new construction doesn't have to be held to the historic styles, even in a historic context. It can still be contemporary. But beyond the design strategies, there are lessons in the planning and the implementation. There are nuances in the developer and designer interface that are important to point out in terms of reconstructing and how we might, models for other parts of St. Louis. So one is the fact that the designers and developers were residents of the district. They lived there and they were active in the process that gave them a really different stake in what they were doing there. It's, to me, a new form of public process that we should consider, where it's not the public meetings anymore, it's conversations with your neighbor and talking to them at the school. It gave the designers a new lens into the issues in the neighborhood, and it allowed them to constantly recalibrate real time now as they're developing. Another procedural innovation was in the title and the financing. Because they were such a young firm, they didn't have the kind of capital to buy all of these properties up front. So the Land Holding Authority was able to redesign some of the legal aspects of the title transfer, and that was key so that they could get those tax credits and the financing could be carried through. These are the kinds of creative tools that can go a long way to open up the city to smaller actors and more independent change agents. I think it was pointed out in Sylvester's Sweet Potato Project, where even something as simple as access to land, it's hard to get over some of these hurdles that are set in the bureaucracy, like land use and some of these other bureaucratic legal areas. Another critical component is the school that was mentioned. The designers were able to attract, together with the other partners, a charter school to the main intersection of the neighborhood, and it filled in this warehouse space. And even though it's a charter school, we think of charter schools as bringing students from a really large catchment from across the region. And in this case, the charter school, which was already an existing Montessori-style school, said that they were not going to go beyond the neighborhood. So it was going to be a local school. And that's really critical. It's critical. And it's critical because now we have, as part of the design, not just a facelift in terms of the redevelopment, but we're setting the stage for a much more meaningful structural change for the residents that are there, beyond just commercial development and housing alone. And that's hard in a political economy that relies on this public-private partnership. We know that private development can't always, they can't afford to take on social goals. So here's an example of where it's done. Somehow they got this done. There's commercial development here too. They attracted, in this old gas station, a wine bar and restaurant. And the critique here is that these are too high-end for the existing residents. most of the residents, the fact is, had been cleared out, and I'm wrapping up. There were only 5 families left, in fact, when the Phase 2 transformation started. And that's a really important fact because it circles back to how we define a neighborhood that's rebounding and how we start to set some of these narratives about change and what's happening, and back to the notion of a divided city to me. Redevelopment as a success here, the residents were gone, so it exposes the flaws in that, the way we measure change. Obviously, the population growth, the average income, the number of owner-occupied units, whatever you're going to measure is not going to apply to the people who were here before and left. And as planners and designers, we have to continue to reconceptualize structures like that and how we measure change. It's very important for St. Louis. So the last question is whether or not this neighborhood is rebounding and whether or not it's still divided. And I just want to point out that the 2 phases need to be seen together. They create together a space of separation between the McCree with its troubled identity and these issues, and then the Botanical Heights that moves in. And if we understand it instead as a cumulative project, then we can expose the practices of erasure that are these mechanisms for physical, political, social separation here. I see these separations as divides, again, in the city, but in time and space. So this is not about the Del Mar Divide, where you have a geographic line with rich and poor and black and white on one side or another. This is the replacement, right? So there's an overlay in space, and time becomes the kind of critical piece in there. A divided city overlaid across time. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. We're almost there. Almost there. It is a pleasure to be here. I really want to thank the institutions, both Washington University and Harvard, for the invitation to come talk to you about a subject that is dear to my heart, which is the city of St. Louis. Graphic School of Design, GSD, I've heard that referred to a few times here, GSD. In my work, GSD means something else. Get stuff done. And really depending on your audience, the S might mean something else, but let's just say it means stuff. Get stuff done. And that's primarily what I've been focused on in my role as an alderman in the city of St. Louis. Quickly, just a little bit about me. The area that I represent, the 21st Ward of the city of St. Louis, is the neighborhood and the area that I was born and raised in. So this is my community. I've known it my whole life. I am, as we say, so St. Louis. And let me tell you how St. Louis I am. We've heard stories about how many of these neighborhoods rapidly turn from all white to all black. My mother's parents were the second African-American family to move on our block. My father's parents were the fourth African-American family to move on our block. That is how my mother and father met. That's how I was born. And now I'm raising my son on the same block. I'm so St. Louis. So let me tell you, if I can figure out how to use this thing. So my ward, the 21st Ward, when I was elected in 2009, I went about trying to figure out how we can rebuild this community. I am not interested in just keeping a seat warm. I'm interested in transformative change. And so the first couple of years of my term as alderman, I spent trying to navigate city government, figure out how we can finally get St. Louis city government to work for these North St. Louis communities, something that, as you've heard, has not gone very well in recent decades. After 2 years, I came to a conclusion. We're on our own. And if we are trying to convince the mayor's administration, or we're trying to convince state leaders to value our community, it is going to be a very long, hard fight. We're still fighting that, but in the meantime, we have to GSD, get stuff done. And so what I did was draw a line in the sand. So we created what we call North Campus. Now, these boundaries are roughly the same boundaries as the 21st Ward, and inspired by a couple of realizations. One, inspired by what occurs in the Harlem Children's Zone, which probably many of you are familiar with. In Harlem, Dr. Jeffrey Kennedy and his crew drew a line in the sand and said that ultimately we are going to become responsible for the kids that live in this community. We are going to build a pipeline of success from birth through college graduation. And so we took that principle and merged it with some of the unique qualities of St. Louis government. In fact, some of the unique qualities of being an alderman in city government, where a lot of what happens in our communities as an alderman does go through us in one way or another. So using my position as alderman, what it allows me to do is help direct traffic. Okay, so there's a realization that we also came up, is that between public entities, private entities, nonprofits, the school districts, the police department, city government, state government, federal government, we have collectively spent tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars and have not increased academic performance, have not increased population, have not stabilized communities, and in fact, in many ways, many of our resources are being wasted. So let me just say that Washington University, I am also a graduate of Washington University, but I graduated from the business school, so we have a different perspective. And so when it comes to wasting resources, I think that was something that, that we needed to deal with primarily. To me, I hate seeing money or resources wasted. And so we formed the North Campus Partnership, which is a nonprofit organization, which has done as the Harlem Children's Zone has done, has drawn this line in the sand, said that this is our campus, and that we will ultimately be responsible for building that pipeline of success for children from birth through college graduation. And we will also recognize another reality, which is that many of these different agencies are fighting the problem from their perspective. So St. Louis Public Schools is fighting the problem from their perspective. And then after 3 o'clock, the police department fights the problem from their perspective. And then the school district and the city government is all fighting the problem from their perspective, but there isn't one central agency that is coordinating efforts and recognizing it's really all the same problem. Instability in neighborhoods, instability in families. And so what we've done is, number one, we started taking some of these vacant buildings and turning them into anchors, into places that not, as a vacant building doesn't just pull a community down, but as an occupied anchor, it actually brings the community together. This was a building that was vacant, a church building. Now, as many people know with these church buildings is that if you don't get them early, they really fall into such disrepair that there's almost nothing you can do with them later. So we were very lucky to get this building only a few months after it became vacant. And working with, and again, this is a unique position of being an alderman and being able to work with the owner of that building, who at that time was asking $250,000, $300,000 for the building, which they were never going to get. So the building was just going to sit there. Eventually somebody would break into it, it would catch on fire, and it would sit there for 20 years. So we worked with them to explain what we were trying to do, and they sold us this building for $30,000. And we raised that money within 7 days. And a couple of years later, we found this building, which is located about 6 blocks away from the other building. This building had been vacant for almost 20 years. It used to be a boxing gym. We got this building, again, for next to nothing, have renovated it, and now it's home to our 3rd through 5th grade program. Along the way, again, in an effort to coordinate efforts, we had another project go on with the city, which was build a new $20 million recreation center in O'Fallon Park, which is also located on campus. So working with the operator of that building, we have now taken a space in that building and house our high school program in it. Currently, these school buildings here are owned by the city of St. Louis. This is all on the same campus. And as of this morning, we just signed paperwork to buy these buildings from the city, the whole block, for $50,000. So what we have come to the realization of is that in many ways, these are not problems of money. These are problems in allocation of resources and having the will to actually to do some of these things. Many of these properties are acquired for next to nothing, and many of these properties we have renovated for very, very little. We are also purchasing this vacant school building from St. Louis Public Schools. We again have entered into an agreement with them which would allow us to purchase the building for about $50,000 as well. And so we are expanding, and what this means is that we are turning these vacant buildings into anchors all around campus. And this model is really based off of both an appreciation for what the Harlem Children's Zone has done, but also my time in a college town. We talked earlier about college towns. I went to Auburn University, and one of the things that you know about a college town is that the entire town, everything is set up around creating a safe space for those kids to be successful in that period of time when they're studying. And that's kind of the model that we're taking here with North Campus. Now, we've talked a lot about some of the challenges that face people who are trying to get stuff done in St. Louis. We talked a lot about the racial divisions of St. Louis, but there's also a very real political division. These maps are of the last mayoral election. And you see that map on the left there. North St. Louis voted clearly for one guy. South St. Louis clearly voted for the incumbent mayor. And so North St. Louis, and this happens election after election, North St. Louis gets outvoted. But North St. Louis has clearly expressed its displeasure with how the city is being ran. And for all that, though, we have not seen any kind of olive branches being reached out by the administration. We've also seen a lot of doom and gloom about North St. Louis, and I want to leave you with a couple of positive notes. Number one, all of North St. Louis is not the same. It's very important to understand that, is that a lot of the despair and a lot of the deterioration and vacancy varies neighborhood by neighborhood and block by block. These are images of homes in North St. Louis. This is in the Penrose neighborhood. This is also in the Penrose neighborhood. These are all from my Instagram account, if anybody wants to follow. This is in the College Hill neighborhood, which is actually one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, has among the highest rate of vacancy, but a woman who grew up in that neighborhood and has done well for herself decided to come back to that neighborhood to build her home. Didn't go to the county, didn't go to the suburbs. She came and built her dream home. Now, that's a little bit more suburban than I would have chose, but I appreciate her investment in our community. This house is located across the street from that house. These are some beautiful houses that are occupied right now in North St. Louis. And too often, a lot of big-scale projects are being funded, and they use these images of North St. Louis deteriorating to say, look, we have to do something. I mean, it's awful. Nobody wants to live over there. Let's just flatten it all and start something different. And so I think it's important for us to understand that people live here. These are still neighborhoods for a lot of folks, and they need services. They need attention. Many of these North St. Louis neighborhoods are still more populated than many more affluent South St. Louis or Central Corridor neighborhoods, but don't get the same level of attention. And the city of St. Louis, frankly, if it had a zero growth problem, would be an improvement. We have difficulty keeping the people that already live there. And we experience the most growth in neighborhoods like these, where folks who live in houses like this, who maintain their yards, who maintain their communities, aren't getting the support from the city. They get tired of living next to decay and having vacancy so close to them, and they leave. And that's really our latest challenge, is keeping the folks who are there and making sure that they understand that they are appreciated as citizens of the city of St. Louis. I want to leave you with a couple of things, some ideas. Number one, I think that any solution has to involve empowering black people in St. Louis. Now, let's just make it very clear. Now, for folks that don't know St. Louis is mostly black and white. We don't have a lot of Hispanics or Asians, so the conversation about diversity is really kind of binary. It's black and white. But most of the solutions that we have seen related to North St. Louis and African American communities involve empowering outsiders to come in and drop in a solution in the middle of our neighborhood, and that does not work. And in many cases, that solution, as was discussed in the previous presentation, involves displacing the people who live there. And that, to me, is not a solution. So when I'm speaking about North St. Louis, I'm not just talking about real estate and geography. I'm talking about people. Secondly, the solution has to be bottom up, not top down. It has to involve empowering the folks who live in those communities to rebuild their own community. It cannot be something that is done too often. These big ideas are thought of on a college campus or in a downtown office building and then presented to the world. These ideas must come from the community themselves if they are going to be successful. And I'll also say this, and this might be a hard one to swallow, is that many corporate and educational institutions have been complicit in a lot of the stuff that we've talked about. And it is one thing to be able to talk about some of the injustices of the past, but we also must acknowledge what's happening today and what we're doing about what's happening today. And lastly, there is opportunity in crisis. So one of the things I love most about St. Louis, and I encourage any OSU students, SLU University students, anybody coming to St. Louis, is that this is the place in the environment where you actually can affect change. It is a small enough pond where you can make a big splash. And if you want to do radical ideas with vacant space or buildings, if you want to go in and buy a beautiful 5,000 square foot, 100-year-old house and do some crazy renovation with, you can get that house for about $15,000 in St. Louis. You can take the entire half a block next to you and do some crazy stuff. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is create an environment for experimentation, rehabilitation, and just, people coming in doing some really good, cool things in North St. Louis. This is a tweet I sent out earlier today. The challenge isn't just discussing past racial injustice. The real challenge is correcting racial injustice you're participating in today. And I think that's a thought I want to leave you with, is that there are things going on right now. We have hinted at this NGA project, this Paul McKee project. There are things that are going on right now that mirror some of the injustices that we've discussed from decades ago. Thank you.
To the rapid time constraint, because now we actually have some time to chat and you get to your cocktails on time. So let me just say just 2 or 3 quick things, and then I'm going to cede my questions to the panel to the students in the audience first, and then everyone else. So as this was supposed to be the panel that was to inspire us and think about aspirations and actions forward, just a couple of things stuck out from your remarks. The notion of considering memory versus erasure. I think Michael and Patty spoke to that. The aspects of spatial connectivity that we saw through examples of your design, but also social and social agency connectivity, which relates to local empowerment, leadership, and participation, the demand for that, as we've seen through examples in the work of CDCs. And I think what Alderman French insisted is a crucial component of what might be a just St. Louis. Resource access and allocation in the hands of those who are in a position to have local impact and agency. So it's not just enough for St. Louis to get a big grant or award, but it's also about whose hands it goes into and whose hands direct it. And I think for this issue of scale, and we've been talking about it as a spatial scalar issue, I think perhaps it's more this issue of needing to work comprehensively, integrated across sector and issue, and in very targeted ways. So this notion that the neighborhood unit is perhaps the space to work in integrated fashions and with the allocation and access to resources, and that we can begin to look at integrated tactics and integrated collective agencies working. Because in fact, the greatest asset that this city has is that there are 318,000 people who reside here. So this is not a place that's going to get thrown away. And I remember in my work in Detroit, you know, when we started in 2009, 2010, we had people running for president, you know, saying close the door on 700,000 people, which is absurd. So this is a place where people live, reside, and have resounding pride. And so I think you've begun to give us some thoughts about that. My last question for you, which will be for your closing remarks, which is to humor me and perhaps give me an idea or us an idea to leave with on what would you say your just city, the just St. Louis must have? What are the one or two things that the just St. Louis must have? So think about that. Let's turn the microphone over to some students and see if there's some questions that they have for our panelists. Now, I've given you the floor, so there's no time to be shy, and I will call out people because I do recognize faces. So anybody have any questions? Come on, don't embarrass me. Thank you. Break the ice. And I'm going straight for that corner up there, somewhere.
So I suppose I have a question that was raised by a couple different people, but with different vocabulary. And so whether it's anchor institutions or kind of, well, maybe I'll paraphrase, but asset-based community development. But generally speaking, this notion that there is something or someone in a collective sense that exists in a particular community, and that it is around that which we will begin to rebuild. It is around that in which empowerment can happen. And so I'm curious as to whether you feel as though there are some inappropriate selections for that role. I feel as though there's a lot of different institutions that can play that role. We've heard universities and botanical gardens and maybe even a church or an alderman's office, but are there inappropriate selections or ineffective ones that we should not be targeting as a site around which to build collective action?
I think that's yours.
Well, you want specifics?
Antonio.
Oh, sure.
You don't have to name names.
The NGA? I don't know. Or no, not NGA. National Geospatial.
That's it. NGA.
Yeah, agency.
Yeah. So I think that ultimately, whether it's a successful anchor is decided by community input and community buy-in. So just if you locate a gas station in the middle of some place, it doesn't necessarily become an anchor institution. Is it a place that has community buy-in? Is it a place where people congregate, people come together? I think ultimately that's going to be what decides it. As you mentioned with NGA, it is, whether it's NGA or any of these other projects where an outside developer has decided to drop something in the middle of a community and displace people, that won't be an anchor for the kind of development that I think many of us would want to see. It may become an anchor for relocating and then bringing other people into a community. But as far as having a community-based approach that is not gentrification, I think ultimately that's going to be decided by the people who live there, if it's an anchor or not.
And I'll just add one quick thing to that as someone who's worked in communities that are weak markets, like a Newark, like a St. Louis, et cetera. I think what happens when you work in cities like that have had these decades of disinvestment, and then all of a sudden you get this shiny thing that could come, your instinct is to grab it. right? And because you're operating from a point of a low negotiating point, like, I just need that. And I think the senator said this in her remarks earlier. It's like, yeah, that's nice, but if it's coming and it brings jobs, where are those jobs really going? Is it exporting jobs with it? Or is there really an opportunity and an economic play for that local community? And I think in order not to repeat the mistakes of past interventions, is for even weak markets to raise the bar of their threshold of what they can demand, right? And this is how we move towards a greater justice in cities. So it's not enough just to get in GA or anything else. And I hate to pick on that example because it's imminent wherever it's going. But it is too, when you're considering that and you're weighing, the benefits of trying to reconcile some of these historic losses, is that you don't do that in face of looking 10 years out and you've kind of repeated or extended the loss. But it really is the moment to try to get people to the table of really action and not the complacency that Antonio French was speaking about. And I think that's really critically important when thinking about anchor institutions, whether they're an academic institution or an economic kind of anchor that's coming in cities.
I just wanted to add to that. That it's very hard in this political economy to ask institutions, whether they're nonprofit or businesses, what have you, to, they have to meet a bottom line, and it's hard to ask them to take on other social responsibilities. And I think of, actually, you're asking what's the right kind of institution or wrong kind of institution. I think of it like, who would you get to babysit your kids, right? Somebody that has the goals and that would value your kids, and somebody that would have the goals of your kids' best interests in mind, and not someone who's just there to make some money and kind of distracted or, happens to be there. But, it's sort of I don't know, we ask a lot of our institutions, but that's the position we're put in. And I think there are many institutions doing remarkable work on a lot of levels. But we have to be kind of realistic, too.
I think that's a good discussion we need to continue in St. Louis, because the time continuum for some of these things has taken a while. And so the CDC model has worked in some places. The Beyond Housing is a good example. As Patty, as you're talking about the Garden District Commission, it had an anchor, but has an anchor that also has its own, shall we say, corporate mission. But it did convene a CDC model that included residents in doing the planning and doing a postmortem on that. And then there are Antonio mentioned that abandoned church got turned into being an anchor. So we need to sort of figure out about the scale and how we can make anchors where there are no anchors to be catalysts in these in neighborhoods.
Is this question or comment here? Here, John?
Well, yeah, only if there's no students, though.
We'll keep it going.
I'm always learning.
Well, so the question I have is actually really quite simple and maybe actually simplistic, which wouldn't be surprising. But there's a strong narrative thread in a lot of the conversations yesterday and today, and my own presentation included, that really values this bottom-up, grassroots, community dug-in kind of approach, which I think all of us value very highly. And in many ways, this is exactly as Alderman French said, this is how it's going to get done. We have to do it. At the same time, I wonder if the panelists could maybe think a bit beyond the confines of St. Louis or beyond Cambridge or beyond any one place, because the problems that what created the problems in St. Louis were global forces. They were massive transformations of economies that stretched across space and time, over which I have to say the government of St. Louis had very little control. City governments can't trap capital. They can't keep people from leaving. There's a whole range of things they simply can't do. They're rather weak governmental entities to some degree. Now, at the same time, we know what they did do to foster segregation, things like that. So I'm wondering, between this grassroots this commitment of grassroots organizations, and between these city governments, which have actually very weak capacity to trap capital and to do the kinds of things that we would really like to see them do. What is the role in terms of federal policy, for example, or national policy, to begin rebuilding these communities? This isn't an isolated problem in St. Louis. This affects cities all across the United States. What can we do at a larger level or a larger scale to affect policy? And I'd love to hear any ideas about that.
Well, I am an advocate of getting that scale of action down to the neighborhood and the city level. I think cities do have some power. For instance, the city does have regulations, codes. You still need to work with them. And in the case of the New Orleans example, we just got them into the same room with the planner, so we weren't designing something and then running up against a wall when we went down to the building department. They didn't have a lot of money, but they had a role. We designed those 8 blocks, but we still needed sidewalks and streetlights that were on the other side of the property line. So I don't know if this is a federal role as much as it is being very specific and organizing the resources in that specific community to get projects built. We have used LISC. We've used maybe 15 or 16 funding approaches for just one project, but it took that sort of ground up local organization to get it done. And by the way, when we were doing Lafitte, the feds were, let's say we didn't depend on the feds. Our group, Enterprise and L&M, said we'll handle that. We'll account for them later, but we're not going to stop. We're going to start now. We'll figure that accounting out later. But it was the sense of urgency and forward motion by the local neighborhood group and that, the community who was absolutely behind it. They became the advocates for the project. Point is that they helped us keep the forward motion to get the project built, and it wasn't relying on actors that we actually couldn't see from the Sojourner Truth community room.
Well, I was going to, is this on? In response to the previous question, I was going to, I guess, make a lot of enemies in this room by pointing out that historically, planners were seen as the bad guy. Everybody's put up these maps that Harlan Bartholomew drew across the city, and that was seen as the people who were really causing problems and remaking the city according to their own ideals. I think planning has been remade itself, and I also think, in response to Joseph's question, when planners step back, when institutions step back, what steps in is the market itself. And so capital flees, or you get whatever big box stores on 125th Street in Harlem. So there has to be some kind of balance, and I think one answer, which I think the low-income housing community has seen, is you cannot build significant amounts of low-income housing without government engagement. And even if the federal government was discredited by urban renewal, we still need the federal government involved if they're going to address some of these problems.
Yeah, maybe I'm going to make a little bit more enemies than you, because I think most of us in the room know that planners have been sort of demonized and are trying to claw our way back into relevance. See, because, we've heard today the foundations for those fears, and they're legitimate, right? Yeah. So we got to own that and try to struggle to move past it. But in my work recently, I've been trying to move communities beyond it's community driven or it's top down binary, because I don't think either of those get you to where you need to be, which is really a collective and shared table of responsibility, vision, and action. Now, I recognize that in a lot of cities, and I think you've kind of described the context in St. Louis, it's what I confronted in Detroit, is that because of the waves of privatization, because of the waves of economic growth that have moved offshores and stripped a number of these communities of any economic vibrancy, communities and sectors are left to fend for themselves. So you said, like, we're on our own. When I got to Detroit, everybody was like, I can't count on them. They can't, you know, so we're kind of in our trenches trying to do our own thing. That cannot be, you know, that status quo cannot be the way we move forward, right? So the radical transformation is the work of setting those collective tables back. So the work is done with everyone at the table, sharing that responsibility, creating that collective vision, and owning up to collective action. And so the work, in absence of really moving towards a federal, national policy on urban cities, right? So when we were doing work in Detroit, the sister city was Torino, right? The automobile capital of Italy, that had gone through a similar economic crisis around the automobile industry and around oil and et cetera, and they fell hard in the same way that Detroit did and other auto communities did in the US. There was federal national policy that helped rebuild Torino. That plus the fact it was a smaller, more compact urban city, unlike Detroit, which is a small, sprawling, single-family city. So the compactness of the city plus federal policy enabled it to transform itself, transform its economy. We don't have that. So in the absence of that, we have to move towards these collective integrated processes of change that are inclusive of grassroots, community-led, and all these other institutions sitting at the table. So the way we started in Detroit in 2009 was Mayor Dave Bing, the head of the Kresge Foundation, the head of the civic leaders, the head of the NAACP came together as one table and put their collective face forward and said, this is what we have to do, taking advantage of that crisis to say, we can no longer act and live the way we are. The status quo is unacceptable. Had it not been for those sectors coming together, I don't think we'd be talking about Detroit in the way that we are today. And I just think in absence of that federal agenda, this has got to be the way that we move forward.
But capital hasn't entirely fled the city. There's capital coming back into the city. We need to understand how to make it in their interest to make some of that capital flow into the city to the mutual benefit of helping us to remake the city. They're taking advantage of.
But that's why the shared vision is so important, because capital likes to go into predictable markets where there's a clear agenda around what you want it to do. Otherwise, it will go off and do things on its own.
No.
Without being, without some direction. And it just seems like, at least by the folks who are here today that are doing this good work on the ground, that perhaps you are in a sweet spot to begin to put those collective tables together for that kind of action.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to intervene here, only because I'm cognizant of the fact that people have to catch a plane just when we're getting into yet another amazing conversation. So, I'm sorry, Colin, I can't call on you, but we're going to move into Cocktail and Stubbins. A few things I want to say. Thank you very much for actually this question and this last response, Tony, because I think it's brought us full circle back to the nation again. We started with kind of the nation and the global imaginary, whether it's Empire Nation, brought it down to the problems of St. Louis, and now we're going to move back up that chain, hopefully in a more constructive way, bringing together actors horizontally and vertically. It's been an amazing day. I'm really sorry it's ending because I think we're just starting the conversation. I want to thank everybody profusely who came, who contributed, who shared their great work, their ideas, their passion, all of you who stayed most of the day. Students who didn't ask questions, I'm going to talk to you later. But it's been an amazing day. I want to thank everybody for participating. We will move into the other room. We'll do a round of applause in a second, but we will move into the other room, and there I will ask Professor Stephen Gray. Maybe Stephen can say a little something as we move in there, because he's been the faculty coordinator and hands-on activist in a way here at the GSD, working with students, and we're going to get a peek of their work and hopefully for those of you who are still here, you can come back tomorrow for that. So let's just give a round of applause to the panel.
So we're going to move right across the hall into Stubbins 112. There's an amazing exhibit that the students have put together themselves. They did a call for proposals around the topic of designing justice. And it's a little teaser for tomorrow's student panel where we can continue a lot of these conversations that we've started today. So please join us across the hall. Oh, yes. So the keynote tomorrow will be Dr. Tia Martin, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for Boston. St. Louis will be naming their Chief Resilience Officer in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I hear. So it might be a good opportunity also for a number of you to hear some conversation and where Boston stands in the resilience conversation, which has been framed specifically around race, racism, and justice in the city. So we're not so much focused on the environmental resilience in Boston under Dr. Tia Martin's charge, but more so the race issue. So that will be in the middle of the two student panels, and David Harvey will be the respondent for both panels.